I was standing in the middle of my daughter's living room, gripping my old handbag like it was the only thing keeping me upright, when my son-in-law laughed straight to my face. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward one. A cruel, confident laugh. He leaned back on their leather sofa and said, "You don't even earn enough to pay rent, so don't pretend you have a say here." The words landed hard. My daughter stared at the floor like it had suddenly become fascinating. My grandchildren whispered and smirked, covering their mouths as if I couldn't hear them. I felt every pair of eyes scan me, my thrift store coat, my worn shoes, my outdated phone peeking out of my bag. In that moment, I wasn't their mother or grandmother. I was an embarrassment they wanted erased. They didn't lower their voices. They didn't soften the blow. They told me, right there, that I was no longer welcome in their home because I made them uncomfortable. Because I didn't fit the image. Because my low income, my simplicity, my very presence made them feel ashamed. What hurt most wasn't the insults. It was the ease with which they dismissed me. Years of love reduced to a joke. Decades of sacrifice rewritten as failure. And the irony. Just hours earlier, I had made a quiet decision, one that, if they'd known, would have frozen every smug smile in that room. I stood there thinking, if they only knew where their comfort really came from. As they walked me toward the door, my daughter finally spoke. She didn't apologize. She didn't defend me. She sighed and said, "Mom, this is just how things are now. You should understand." That was the moment something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Stay with me till the end, because what happens next will shock you. And if you love emotional revenge stories like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more. Because that humiliation didn't come out of nowhere. It was the final scene in a long, quiet story of disrespect I kept forgiving, explaining away, and paying for literally and emotionally. What they never realized was that behind my silence was a truth they never bothered to question. To understand how everything fell apart, I have to take you back to where it all began, long before they decided I was disposable. My name is Ruth, and this is my story. After I retired, my life became small, quiet, and predictable, and I told myself that was a blessing, not a failure. I lived alone in a narrow apartment with creaking floors and windows that rattled when buses passed. Every purchase was measured. Every bill was planned for weeks ahead. I cooked simple meals, folded my clothes neatly, and reminded myself daily that needing little was a kind of freedom. I never wanted to be a burden. That mattered to me more than anything. I had raised my daughter to stand on her own feet, and when she did, I stepped back proudly. She was ambitious, sharp, always chasing the next level. Her husband was confident to the point of arrogance, a man who spoke about success like it was a competition he intended to win. Their children watched closely, learning what mattered from every tone and glance. Family gatherings, at first, felt warm enough. I babysat when they asked, cooked meals they praised without really tasting, and listened as my daughter talked about promotions, schools, and better neighborhoods. I was proud of her. Genuinely proud. She had more than I ever did, and I thought that meant I had done my job right. Money came up often, but always as jokes. Winners and losers. People who made it and people who didn't. I laughed along, even when the jokes landed too close. I didn't want to seem bitter. I didn't want to explain myself. When they asked about my income, I kept it vague. A simple pension. A few savings. Enough. Peace mattered more to me than appearances ever had. What I didn't say was that I'd always been careful. Quietly careful. I planned, saved, and prepared without advertising it. I believed dignity lived in silence. I believed love wasn't measured in paychecks or labels. I truly thought respect came naturally with family. I remember sitting at their table one evening, watching them argue about money like it was a scoreboard, and thinking, I thought love mattered more than numbers on a paycheck. I didn't realize then that something subtle had already shifted. That was the first time money stopped being background noise and became something sharp, something pointed. Looking back now, I can see how easily kindness blended into expectation. How help quietly turned into assumption. I mistook familiarity for safety and patience for love. That night, as laughter filled the room and no one noticed my silence, a strange unease settled in my chest. I ignored it, not knowing it was a warning. I would soon learn how quickly respect disappears once money enters the conversation. At first, the changes were so small I almost felt silly noticing them. Comments slipped into conversations like crumbs left behind on purpose. My son-in-law would glance at my shoes and joke about vintage fashion, then laugh a little too long. My daughter corrected my words mid-sentence, smiling as if helping, but doing it in front of everyone. When I offered advice, it was brushed aside with, "Things are different now, Mom." I told myself this was normal. Times change. People grow. Then came the favors. They were never called that. It was always framed as temporary, casual, no big deal. Could I cover a school fee until next month? Could I help with groceries because an unexpected expense came up? Each request came with reassurance that they were managing just fine. I said yes every time, quietly, without keeping score. Gratitude faded quickly, replaced by assumption. The jokes sharpened. "You wouldn't understand how expensive life is," my son-in-law said once, waving his phone like proof. My daughter laughed, then caught my expression and added, "No offense." There was always a cushion word at the end, as if that erased the impact. I began to feel like a guest in conversations I used to belong to. I noticed how they spoke about money when they thought I wasn't listening. Success meant visibility. Struggle meant weakness. People were ranked without mercy. I smiled, nodded, and folded myself smaller. Inside, confusion churned. I had given my life to providing stability, and somehow that effort had become invisible. I questioned myself constantly. Was I too sensitive? Too old-fashioned? I replayed moments alone, wondering when respect turned conditional. My silence became part of the pattern. Each time I paid a bill or slipped cash into an envelope, their tone grew lighter, freer, as if relief came without acknowledgement. One evening, my son-in-law said, "At least you don't have real financial stress," and everyone agreed. The room felt suddenly airless. I realized then that money had stopped being private. It had become a measuring stick, and I was already on the wrong side of it. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I just sat there, understanding for the first time that kindness, once expected, is no longer valued. That realization stayed with me long after I left that night. It echoed in small looks, delayed replies, and the way help was requested without humility. I sensed something shifting beneath the surface, something colder, calculating. I didn't yet know how far it would go, only that the next time money came up, it wouldn't sound like a joke anymore. And it would leave scars none of us were prepared to acknowledge when everything finally collapsed. It became impossible to ignore the patterns anymore. My daughter and son-in-law's smiles were no longer warm, they were precise, measured, and always tied to some gain. Gifts appeared at the dinner table, but they weren't for me, they were for the appearances of generosity, a way to signal status without ever acknowledging the source. The house seemed to shine with new furniture, flashy gadgets, and vacations that arrived like clockwork. And yet, the gratitude I expected to feel from them never came. Instead, I began to notice glances, whispers, and little smirks whenever I offered help. I started keeping track quietly, just in my mind, of every time I had secretly covered expenses: a credit card payment for my daughter, tuition for the grandchildren, repairs for their car, even rent during months of tight budgets. Every favor was paid for in silence, with no recognition, no thank you, no acknowledgement. And yet, in their eyes, I was insignificant, a relic of a past they wanted to forget. My heart ached with betrayal, but I kept it hidden. Their behavior shifted further. Small slights became consistent patterns. Invitations would arrive late, as though my presence was optional. Conversations turned dismissive, casual insults slipped in disguised as jokes. My daughter would correct my words, my son-in-law would chuckle condescendingly, and my grandchildren mirrored it all with uncanny precision. I began to question myself, wondering if I had misjudged their intentions or if I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew. I had been patient, and patience had been met with entitlement. One afternoon, I overheard them discussing financial matters without even considering that I might be listening. My daughter said, "It's amazing how much she does without anyone noticing. I almost feel guilty, but it's easier to pretend she doesn't exist." My son-in-law nodded, smirking. That moment hit me like a punch to the chest. Not only had they erased my contributions, They had reframed them as invisible, insignificant, and irrelevant. I began to feel the weight of years of silence, of generosity taken for granted, of respect never returned. I doubted myself often in those days. Was I too old-fashioned? Too trusting? Too naive to see the real motives behind the smiles and pleasantries? Yet, beneath the doubt, a seed of clarity grew. I realized their arrogance and entitlement were fueled by my quiet support, and they had no idea that I had quietly built the foundation they relied on. The realization was bitter, but it carried a dangerous potential. Knowledge is power, and the moment I fully understood just how dependent they were on me, I knew the course of our lives could change entirely. That night, as I closed the door to my apartment, I sat alone, replaying every interaction with new eyes. Their hidden motives were clear now, etched into their words and actions. They didn't just take my help, they took my dignity, my love, and my presence for granted. And while I didn't yet act, the thought of reclaiming both justice and respect began to whisper, quietly, insistently, in the back of my mind. The loneliness settled in like a weight I couldn't shake. Each time I sat at my small kitchen table, I replayed the events of the day over and over in my mind. The jokes, the corrections, the dismissive glances, they weren't just casual remarks anymore. They were patterns, etched into my daily life like invisible scars. I had spent decades giving everything quietly, yet every act of kindness was returned with disregard. It was as if the more I gave, the less I mattered. I found myself waking in the early hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering where I had gone wrong. Was it my choice to stay silent for so long? Was it my inability to demand respect? Each question cut deeper than the last. I loved them fiercely, but love without acknowledgement had begun to feel like a trap. I had poured into their lives without expectation, yet the emptiness of their gratitude left me hollow. Even in the moments when I was physically present, I felt invisible. At family dinners, my words seemed to vanish mid-sentence. When I offered advice, it was brushed aside. Every smile I gave was met with polite nods, not warmth. And the money I had secretly contributed, tuition, bills, emergencies, it was a quiet thread connecting our lives, yet it had never earned me a place at the table of respect. I began to realize how deeply the betrayal ran. It wasn't just the dismissive words or casual jabs. It was the understanding that they had learned to take without giving. That they could mock my circumstances without fearing consequence. That my presence, my love, my support, they had all become invisible commodities. And yet, beneath the heartbreak, a small, simmering flame of anger began to grow. The humiliation, the disregard, the betrayal, it started to crystallize into clarity. I could no longer pretend that this was normal family dynamics or that I was imagining things. Something had to change. I remember sitting in my dimly lit apartment, clutching a worn teacup, thinking, I have given them everything, and now I am nothing to them. Tears fell, silent and bitter, but in that grief, a resolve was quietly forming. The world they had built on my quiet labor was unearned, and I realized for the first time that power could be reclaimed without violence, simply by letting the truth unfold. The next day, I returned to them with a calm that belied the storm inside. I carried myself differently, even if only subtly. And as I stepped through the familiar doorway, I knew that the real reckoning, the one that would make them understand, was only beginning. Things escalated faster than I could have anticipated. What had once been subtle jabs and quiet disrespect became open cruelty. The family gatherings I used to cherish turned into minefields, and every word I spoke seemed to be twisted, misinterpreted, or dismissed entirely. My daughter corrected me openly, not with a gentle nudge, but with an air of superiority. My son-in-law no longer bothered to hide his impatience, and the grandchildren mirrored every sharp glance, every sarcastic remark, as if rehearsed. It was at one dinner that it truly went too far. I had brought a simple dessert I had spent hours preparing, hoping to share a moment of warmth. Instead, my daughter waved it away and said, "Why bother, Mom? We have better things now." My son-in-law laughed, echoing her dismissal, and the grandchildren giggled as if participating in some cruel performance. I felt the sting in my chest, the humiliation washing over me like ice water. It was no longer subtle. They were erasing me, rewriting my contributions as meaningless. The underlying betrayal revealed itself in small but damning ways. Invitations were rescinded at the last minute. Phone calls went unanswered. Requests for help were met with thinly veiled complaints about my interference or lack of understanding. Everything I had done for them, the secret financial support, the late-night babysitting, the quiet guidance, was treated as irrelevant, as if my existence was a footnote rather than a foundation. I began to see the patterns clearly. Their greed, their entitlement, their manipulation. It wasn't accidental or occasional. It was deliberate. And yet, beneath my shock and rising anger, a dangerous clarity took root. I realized how dependent they truly were on me, and how much power I had quietly accumulated over the years without their knowledge. One evening, as they boasted about some new purchase or trip, my daughter said, almost laughing, "It's amazing how we manage everything, even when some things don't go as planned." The words hit like a dagger. I understood immediately that they had no idea I had funded more than half of what they flaunted. Their arrogance had blinded them entirely to the truth, leaving a yawning gap between perception and reality. And in that moment, I knew the balance of power had shifted. Their betrayals were now blatant, their motives exposed in every word and action. I no longer felt invisible or powerless. Instead, a quiet resolve began to form, one that would turn their entitlement into reckoning. The next time I confronted them, the scales would finally tip, and they wouldn't know what hit them. I stepped into their living room again, the space that had once felt familiar now charged with tension. Every item, every gleaming surface, every framed photograph seemed to mock me, reminding me of how little they had ever truly seen me. My daughter and son-in-law were mid-argument, their voices sharp, their tempers unchecked. I had been trying to stay quiet, to observe, to measure the right moment, but the moment had arrived, whether I was ready or not. As soon as they noticed me, the conversation stopped. My son-in-law's smirk widened. "Look who decided to join," he said, almost gleeful. My daughter avoided my eyes. The grandchildren peeked over their parents' shoulders, curiosity and mischief lighting their faces. Then came the words I had been dreading, the ones that tore through my chest. "Mom, maybe you should just leave. You make everyone uncomfortable." I froze for a heartbeat, gripping my handbag tightly. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing in. I could feel the years of kindness, the quiet sacrifices, all dismissed in an instant. I had fed, clothed, supported, and quietly funded them for years, and now I was nothing more than a problem to be removed. Every small favor, every late-night call, every penny slipped into envelopes, had been invisible. And yet, despite the humiliation, something stirred inside me, a spark of clarity and quiet anger that demanded action. I remembered every small injustice that had been ignored, every joke that masked cruelty, every request that came with entitlement rather than gratitude. My daughter's voice echoed, "It's just the way things are now. You should understand." It was the breaking point. Her words weren't just dismissive, they were a declaration that my years of devotion and support were irrelevant. That realization hit harder than any insult could. I could see it all now, the subtle betrayals, the manipulation, the arrogance that had been carefully built over time. And more importantly, I knew they had no idea how dependent they had been on me all along. They thought I was powerless, yet I had been quietly holding the reins the entire time. In that moment, a decision crystallized in my mind, firm and unyielding. This was the moment I knew I had to do something. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of necessity, justice, balance, and finally, recognition. The path forward was clear, and the reckoning I had been building for years was about to begin. The room still pulsed with their arrogance, unaware that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, and that the story they thought they controlled was about to turn. The first step was silence. I stopped covering their bills, stopped slipping envelopes into their hands, stopped quietly rescuing them from their self-made crises. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the consequences were immediate. Phone calls went unanswered, credit card balances ballooned, and overdue notices began to stack. I didn't have to raise my voice or make a scene. The reality of their dependence was enough to create tension and panic. I watched from the sidelines as the cracks began to show. My daughter, who once commanded every room with confidence, now argued with her husband over finances she had assumed would always be stable. My son-in-law, who had laughed at my inadequacy, fumed when bills went unpaid and plans fell through. The grandchildren sensed it too, a shift in the air they couldn't quite name. The satisfaction wasn't in cruelty, it was in the revelation of truth. Every small advantage I had quietly provided for years was now absent, and they could no longer ignore how much they had relied on me. Their arrogance had blinded them to the reality that my generosity had been sustaining their lifestyle. I simply let reality speak for itself. I confronted them calmly one evening, presenting records of the contributions they had taken for granted. There was no shouting, no accusations, just facts. My daughter froze, her usual composure cracking. My son-in-law's face flushed as he realized the extent of their dependence, and the grandchildren watched silently, confusion and/or flickering in their eyes. I felt no gloating, only a sense of balance being restored. They had treated me as insignificant, erased my presence, and mocked my contributions. Now, for the first time, they saw the truth. Every comfort, every convenience, every moment of ease had quietly come from me. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense, it was justice delivered through revelation, through the undeniable reality they could no longer ignore. By the end of those tense days, they had begun to comprehend the weight of their actions. I had remained composed, measured, and deliberate. The power I had always quietly held was finally acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, I found a quiet, satisfying sense of closure. They were facing the consequences of their entitlement, and I was reclaiming my dignity and peace without losing myself in bitterness. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as an inconvenience, not as a background figure, but as someone whose presence and contributions demanded recognition. And as they grappled with the truth, I knew the course of our lives had shifted irrevocably, and the reckoning was complete. The days that followed were quiet but charged with tension. My daughter and son-in-law no longer approached me with casual disregard or hidden smirks. Every conversation carried the weight of understanding they had never possessed before. The truth of their reliance, once invisible, was now undeniable. My financial contributions, my quiet support, the foundation I had built for their comfort, all of it had been revealed, and they could no longer pretend it didn't exist. At first, there was defensiveness. My daughter tried to explain away her behavior, citing stress and miscommunication. My son-in-law grumbled about circumstances and obligations. But their excuses fell flat against the facts I calmly presented. There were no angry confrontations, no dramatic shouting matches. The consequences had already settled in, creeping into their daily lives through overdue bills, missed deadlines, and the sudden realization that their security had been quietly maintained by someone they had dismissed. Gradually, humility replaced arrogance. They began to see the patterns they had ignored for years, the small ways they had taken my patience, kindness, and resources for granted. Their children, too, sensed the shift, noticing the respect that had been absent and now restored. It was subtle at first, small gestures, a pause before a remark, a careful acknowledgement of my presence, an unspoken recognition of the role I had always played. I felt a quiet sense of triumph, not born of malice, but of balance finally restored. The people who had mocked, dismissed, and belittled me were now confronted with the reality they had long ignored. Justice had been served in the simplest, most effective way, by revealing the truth and allowing it to take root. In the aftermath, our relationship changed. It was no longer casual, unquestioned, or taken for granted. There was respect, acknowledgement, and a cautious recalibration of boundaries. I regained my dignity, my peace, and my sense of self-worth. The humiliation that had once cut so deeply no longer had power over me. For the first time in years, I felt that the scales had finally balanced. They had faced the consequences of their entitlement, and I had reclaimed my rightful place not as a servant to their comfort, but as the quiet, steady force who had always held everything together. And with that realization, a sense of closure settled in, soft but unshakable, leaving me ready to move forward with clarity and quiet strength. Looking back on everything, I realized that love without boundaries can be dangerous. I had given so much, my time, my money, my patience, without expecting recognition, without demanding respect. I thought generosity alone would protect relationships, that family would naturally honor care and sacrifice. I was wrong. Kindness alone isn't enough when it's met with entitlement and disregard. I hope my story reminds you that self-respect is just as important as love. It's okay to give, but it's not okay to let others diminish you or take you for granted. There is power in quiet observation, in knowing the truth, and in choosing the right moment to assert it. Sometimes, The strongest act of love is holding people accountable while maintaining your dignity. I also learned that revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be effective. Justice can be subtle, smart, and morally balanced. Letting the truth reveal itself, letting consequences unfold naturally, can be far more satisfying than anger or retaliation. There's a strange beauty in watching fairness take its course without compromising your integrity. Most importantly, I learned to value myself as much as I value others. My contributions, my sacrifices, and my love were never worthless. I just had to wait until the moment arrived when the world could no longer ignore them. And when that time came, I found strength, peace, and quiet satisfaction in knowing that respect and recognition are not given, they are earned, observed, and finally acknowledged. Never underestimate your own power, even when it seems invisible. Small actions, careful planning, and patience can change the dynamics of any relationship, even when it feels like you have no control. And sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the harshest betrayals. So if you find yourself giving endlessly without acknowledgement, remember this: your worth is not measured by how others treat you, but by the quiet strength you carry, the love you offer wisely, and the courage to reclaim what is rightfully yours. Life will test you, but it will also teach you the value of standing tall, of letting truth speak, and of walking away when respect is denied. And in the end, peace isn't found in revenge, it's found in knowing you refused to be invisible, and you never allowed anyone else to define your value.